Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Conversations with the Fed event on the Minneapolis Fed's Income Distributions and Dynamics in America Research Project. I am Carmiana Matson, Assistant Vice President of Regional Outreach and Public Programs at the Minneapolis Fed. And I'm joined today by Illenin Kondo, Senior Research Economist at the Minneapolis Fed's Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute. And before I turn it over to Illenin, just a few housekeeping items. Today's presentation is part of our long-running Conversations with the Fed discussion series. I'll place a link in the chat to our previous Conversations with the Fed presentations. And some of you may also be familiar with our recurring series on regional economic conditions. We appreciate you joining us for all of our virtual offerings, and we'll keep you apprised of future events in the series via email. We will be emailing slides for this presentation, as well as a copy of the video link to all registered attendees at some point in the next 2 weeks. Illenin will be entertaining questions during his presentation. So if you have a question at any point, please type it in the chat box on Zoom, and then I will pose those questions to him verbally, as many as we have time for. And finally, we would love to get your feedback at the end of this presentation. So please take a moment to fill out the quick 3-question survey that pops up in your Zoom window when you exit the webinar. And with that, I will turn it over to Illenin.
Thank you, Carmi. Thank you so much for inviting us to talk more about IDA. Hi, everyone. My name is Illenin Kondo. I'm a senior research economist here at the Minneapolis Fed within the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute. And I'll be telling you about IDA, which stands for Income Distributions and Dynamics in America. This is a joint research collaboration between the Minneapolis Fed and the US Census Bureau. A lot of this work has been done as part of our research teams, which include Kevin Rains, Nathaniel Gabay, Brandon Hawkins, John Voorhees, and Adi Wozniak. First things first, it's important to have the usual disclaimers. The first one is that these are my views and the views of my co-authors on the papers we wrote, not the views of the US Census Bureau, the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, the Federal Reserve System, or their staff. Also, Kevin Rains worked on this project while he was at the Census Bureau and a visiting scholar. And finally, all the numbers we'll be showing have the Census Bureau has ensured appropriate access and use of confidential data and reviewed these results for disclosure avoidance protection. All right, so let's get into it. So I think this is maybe a topic that's not too hard to motivate, but let me sort of give the perspective that perhaps motivates this research project best for me. The US is seen as a land of opportunity, but at the same time, we know it's also a land of very salient divide across many different groups. And in the economics conversation, there's been growing interest lately in the nature and the dynamics of economic inequality in America. To give you a sense, as this conversation is happening, there are also some gaps. So this is a quote from some really novel work done by Fatih Güvener, Luigi Pistafera, and Gianluca Violante, where they're having this global project on understanding inequality worldwide. And one of the things they mention is how in the 80s, we only had about 40 articles that had the word inequality published in the 5 top economics journals. Move forward in the 2010s. And what we see is that number jumping to almost 150. And yet for the project, they're really asking to have richer and better micro data that accurately represents income distribution in all of its many facets. So, but what are the facets we think about when we think about income inequality or income differences? Is it just top to bottom, or is there more to it? So let me give you one example of a way to think about the gaps in our understanding. For instance, there is an issue when it comes to small samples. This is a quote from the National Congress of American Indians, and it's really described this label of the asterisk nation. It says American Indian Alaska Native may be described as the asterisk nation because an asterisk instead of a data point is often used in data displays when reporting racial and ethnic data. The point here is when we don't have enough people to be able to say something about a group without basically disclosing any individual outcome. In many reports, we tend not to report any data. As a result, many researchers and policymakers can solve them answer many important questions, but also straightforward questions about the nature of income and income experiences for various groups in America. And I think that that those two perspectives kind of motivate really what is the foundation of the work we're doing in this research project. It's really just the need for granular income distribution. I will tell you a lot about what we learn when we do that. But what we really need sort of to start as a starting point, and this research project will be reporting on what we did and what we find, is that we really need a statistically credible measures of income that are granular, as in fine resolution, and that we can't really typically do in public microdata. What do we mean by granular? Can we do it for different race and ethnicity groups? Can we do it for men versus women? Can we do it by foreign-born studies or age? Can we do it of something that's just not the US, so that we can think about Minnesota as opposed to North Dakota or Mississippi? Can we do it for the intersection of those? Let's think of Asian women in South Dakota, so that we just don't think about Asian women in the US, which can be different across places, or Asian, which can be different in terms of men and women. And that's the granular lens that motivates this work. So today I will be telling you about how IDA as a project has put together statistics and along some key dimensions in terms of understanding sort of the richer quilt of incomes in America. I'll share with you a few findings and some updates along the gender dimension, along the race dimensions, circling back to sort of these exhibits A in terms of the small sample. What do we learn when we use IDA that's different from what we will learn when we use survey data simply? And also, obviously, we'll have a lot of time for Q&A. But as Carmi said, feel free to ask questions as we go. So how does IDA tackle this challenge of just being able to give us a better understanding of how different income and income changes are for different people and different groups in America? IDA it has been built to be a very comprehensive resource so that we can think for different subpopulations in America and different geographies, in particular for what I will be telling you about states today. It's really a public good that allows us, both researchers and policymakers, to be able to just better describe incomes in America. Because we are as part of the Federal Reserve, it's really important for us as well because it just helps us better understanding how the US economy works, because we better understand how the incomes of all Americans work so that we can better achieve the FOSC mandate. So how do we get there? The underlying and key piece that helps us sort of put together IDA is really just a very large granular data set that we construct by combining two very big data sources. The first one is tax records. So in the very restricted and secluded environment of the Federal Statistical Research Data Centers, we're able to work with all the income tax returns from 1040 that have been filed, as well as all employer filed wages and tax statements from W-2s. So these are very confidential resources that we're able to access through our unique partnership. And we leverage the US Census Bureau infrastructure in terms of having identifiers for people, and therefore through the single census and others, to be able to get demographic information, in particular race and ethnicity, for instance. And when we combine those, we're able to basically broaden really the ability to think of these many facets of income and income changes for American and American workers. We have over 6 million statistics built over 20 years that basically come from combining this very, very confidential data that we basically add up into these very small cells where no individual information is disclosed, but we can learn more about different groups and how they fare over time. So just one word in terms of, I understand we have a broad audience, so I'll be going from maybe things that are less trivial, more trivial, to a little less trivial. But this is just a technical point about how we basically bring together these two sources. So on this side, these are sort of the tax records we have. We have all the income tax returns. We don't see everything on them. And we see enough to be able to speak to some types of incomes well. We see what will be line 7, which is total wages and salary on a form 1040. We also see the adjusted gross income, and we see that since 1998, and all our data starts before the pandemic, which is 2019. We also see, so obviously the form 1040 is only available when people file. In contrast, we also have, when we work with the W-2s, we see all the W-2s that employee file. So that means we are able to basically see really the quasi-universal formal earnings in America. And here we also see really two fields. We see total wages and salaries. And then we see sort of these boxes 12AD that contain various things, but really what we observe is deferred compensation. And that allows us to have an augmented notion of wages and salaries plus deferred compensation. This data only start in 2005. So this is the census infrastructure. But as we all know, on the census on the tax record, we don't record a lot of demographic information. For instance, we don't see race and ethnicity. We don't see whether someone was US born or foreign born. And so that's where the linkage is very handy, because we leverage the census infrastructure to be able to link individuals on this tax record to sort of some census data, in addition to data on the housing unit, because as we know, sometimes people may live together, they file separately their income tax returns. So that allows us to link tax data with individuals and the housing units. And those identifiers also allow us to think about how those things are changing, the incomes are changing for those individuals or for those housing units. So how sort of that do we bring it together to build the statistics that I'll be using today to share with you some of our new insights. So as I mentioned, we really see a couple of income concepts. We see wages and salaries both from the individual, from the Form 1040 income tax statement, as well as the W-2s. As I mentioned, we see earnings and the deferrals, and then we see the gross income, the adjusted gross income. The difference between the wages and salaries and the adjusted gross income is really a measure of taxable non-wage income. So this will be incomes that are taxable, let's say, from anything from taxable retirement income to other sort of business income that's also reported. So those are the types of income we can think about. We can see. But whose income? Well, IDA allows us to basically be able to think about incomes in terms of age, by sex, per the question in the US Census Bureau questions, the surveys and the single censuses, male or female. We have a relatively rich set of race and ethnicity groups that allows us to include American Indian Alaska Native, as well as Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders. We have US birth studies, and we do intersection of these things. So we can think about, let's say, Black women or Asian men and so on. As I mentioned earlier, a key point of the data is be able to move beyond the federal way of thinking of top to bottom incomes to start thinking about individual states plus DC. And then we also circled back to this sort of asterisk nation issue by being able to pull together all tribal areas into a synthetic combined native areas geography. In order to be able to say a lot about most groups, we choose not to discard, to work with most of the data as much as we can. So we work with all the income statements aggregated to the household, all the tax W-2 employer file W-2s, and then we also report, in some cases, data only on the subset of W-2s restricted to people in their prime age and who also work enough time, who are reasonably attached to the labor force. As I mentioned, the time horizon is going to be 1998 for the incomes starting in 2005 for the W-2s. And when we think about income changes, because the data is coming in annually, we'll think about changes over 1 year horizons, but also over 5 year horizons when we think about how people are moving up and down the income ladder. What do we measure when we have all that? So we have a lot of data that we need to sort of, for the research questions we're interested in, and also for confidentiality reasons, we have to be careful about what we disclose. And so what IDA contains is income percentile. So when we take a group, we think of how income dollars from top to bottom, also top income shares, meaning it was a share of a group's overall income that goes to its top, and top being different in different ways. Also, when we look at individuals or individual household and we look at their incomes changing over time, how big or small are those changes? Again, these are dollars of changes of those dollars. And then how likely are people to move up and down the income ladder, depending on where they're starting, at the bottom or at the top. So that will be an income mobility statistics. So bringing it back together, how big sort of, what do we gain from being able to combine these two critical sources? Well, with a very large underlying sample, we are potentially having a higher resolution. To give you a sense, we are able to work with, and these numbers are rounded for disclosure purposes again, we're able to work with roughly 170 million observations when we think about the income tax statement, and about 44 million observations when we think about the W-2. To give you a sense or a perspective, when we work with sort of one of the best annual surveys that we use for a lot of economic analysis, which would be the current population surveys, we are basically talking about roughly speaking, 100,000 individuals or 150,000 household measures in 2010. So by going from a couple hundred or thousand observations to a couple more than 100 million observations, we're hoping to be able to zoom in, have this higher resolution in understanding income and how the US economy works for different groups in America. So before sort of going forward and sharing a lot of data and new findings with you, I think it's important to highlight a couple of limitations that many of you may suspect already just by based on what I've told you about the data we use. The first one is that all the statistics and incomes I'll be sharing today are only pre-tax, pre-transfer income. What does that mean? It doesn't, for instance, for groups that are at the bottom of the income distribution, they may be receiving a lot of different transfers. That's not included. But also even at the top, the tax treatment of different types of income can vary not only at the bottom, but also at the top. That means that this data is not really speaking to post-transfer, post-tax income analysis. What it also is important to remember is that this is not only the pre-tax income, income is not wealth and wealth is not consumption. So if we depend on the question we're interested in, we may be, this may not be the suitable data. We still have a wealth and a lot of quality data, but it's not necessarily ideal for that. The second thing is that we would love to speak to even sub-state level analysis, but for now, I think IDA has data at the federal and the state level and the combined native geographic area, as I mentioned. I think but one of the things we really like about this is that there are a lot of policy variations, a lot of things we've been able to learn and understand about the US economy by looking across states. And we think and hope that IDA can still help in that dimension. Finally, I think we don't have all the possible demographic groups. One that really we don't have is education. And the main reason is that education tends to change more over time, and to be wanting to work with education may restrict us to basically to slashing the number of people we use to construct these statistics by potentially a 20-fold. And finally, I think when we think about household, we kind of discard the notion of household head and just aggregate the household income to think our resources available at the household level. With that disclaimer aside, let's turn into some of the things we're learning from IDA. All right. So the first thing is that IDA has a the web resources in IDA online, and we have a really nice web data visualization tool. And I have one exciting update to share with you today. So quickly, if you go to minneapolisfed.org/IDA, IDDA, we have a lot of articles that explain what that does. We have a visualization tool, and you can also download the data. So this kind of goes from the spectrum of very data nerdy person to I'm data curious and I want to learn, or I just want to learn a few things, a few highlights. And we have at least 14 articles online right now, one really thorough research paper, and we'll keep adding. But one thing that I'm really excited to share is this some update to the visualization tool. So if you go on the on DataVis tool, you'll see this box that allows you to choose a percentile of income, a type of earning, a group, a year. And the update is that, I'm sorry. All right. The update is that we're able now to compare not just Hispanic and white, but you can compare any two groups. So that allows you to have a map like this where we're looking at very top earnings in the W-2 space, and we're comparing Hispanic and Black incomes. And the shading tells you that in places, let's say as Alabama, South Carolina, and Florida, top Hispanic earnings are potentially at 25% larger than top Black earnings in those areas, whereas it's not as high in other areas. And this line also shows that, for instance, so this is one of the new comparisons we can make very easily. You can look at that. You can clearly see that after the Great Recession here, we see how sort of top Black earnings are lagging behind the growth we're seeing for top Hispanic earnings and the rest of the country. And I'll circle back to this finding later. And special thanks and kudos to our partners in PA for these updates. We really like it because it gives us this less centralizing understanding of incomes and allows for a richer set of two-way comparisons. We don't always have to travel across the same reference groups to think about how different groups are faring. All right, so now I'm going to start switching gears, and I'm going to tell you a couple of things that we've learned using about gender income differences and earning differences using IDA. So this graph is a little busy, and I'll work you through it. What it shows is these vertical bars go from the bottom 25% of income to the median all the way to the top. And these bars have to be read against the y-axis here. What it tells us is that the top 1% of earnings for men in 2019 was the 90th percentile, meaning 1% of men workers earn more than $400,000. This is what this number means. In contrast, if you look at the top 1% for women, we go from 400,000 to a little more than 200,000. And it's the ratio between the 200,000 and the 400,000, a little more than 200, that gives us this 55%. This number is much lower than this number, which is if we were looking at the median, you will basically get the usual 70 cents on the dollar statistic we get in terms of the gap between women earnings relative to men's earnings. The point here is that the 70 cents on the dollar works pretty well, but the gap starts growing at the top. And if you go to the very, very top, this number falls almost to 40%, when the top 0.1% of men are earning more than $1.3 million, and women are barely making $600,000 at the top. Now, it's not all bad news, but it's also not all great news. What do I mean by that? Here, we're zooming into the top. We're going from the top 2% for men versus women, top 1%, top 0.1%, top 0.1%. And here is the ratio. So this number that was starting at 70% and fell to 40% on the previous chart is now basically keeps falling. And the point here is that the women, and this is not exactly the number I showed you before. This is looking at top earnings. So it's as if I'm taking all earnings that's above $1 million, and I'm asking how many women was a share of those that are women, and there was a share of that are men. The point is this number is very small because women's earnings are systematically lower. And so we are not even at 20% of the top pie of the top incomes. While this is, now the good news obviously is that this is growing, it's catching up, but at this pace, it may take a while. Another thing we like IDA can help us do is that not only we see these gaps and we see that they're growing and they're large, but we can then think of the individual US states as a place where we can learn something about how these differences work. So one thing we can do is that we can ask, let's take a given state in a given year and let's see how the top incomes, how much the top incomes are getting in that state. So this will be in Minnesota from one year to the next, and we're asking, are the top earners in Minnesota getting more relative to a bigger or a smaller share of the pie? So this is the share of the pie going to the top. But now we're using individual states. And we're asking, how was the correlation between the share of the pie that goes to the top changing and women's share of that top of the pie? So there's a slice that goes to the top, and we're asking, as that slice that goes to the top shrinks or expands, are women still getting the same share? And what this number is telling us is that across states, the more earnings go to the top, the smaller the women's share. Another way to look at, so I would like to ponder that, but this is helpful because it tells us that the way income inequality works doesn't systematically lift women's share of income in the same way. So this tide doesn't lift all boats, if you want, when it comes to men and women equally. Another way to look at it is to say, well, when we look at states, across states, some states, men's income are more concentrated than others. So think of it as if we have super earners that are men and super earners that are women, right? So when we look at these super men and these super women, you could ask, are states where the super men are making more, are they also states where the super women are making more? This number tells us that, well, the sign is positive. Places and years where super men earners are earning a little more are also places where super women earners are earning a little more, but not as much. And this, it's not moving in lockstep. So again, and this is sort of confirming some findings we knew in the aggregate, but we can think of the and we can ask now why some states are different than others. But this is important to understand. So part of the inequality is also the fact that at the very top, we have this unequal gender concentration. All right. So that was sort of a couple of highlights from what we can understand and learn from using IDA to think about gender. But obviously, one of the main dimensions where IDA is really useful is race and ethnicity. So I'm going to walk through a couple of ways IDA helps in understanding sort of race and ethnicity differently and leverages these differences we see from top to bottom. So again, this is a little bit of a chart, but a busy chart, but I'm going to walk you slowly through it. These graphs all have on the x-axis the same number, which is we're looking at top incomes for each state. So these numbers grow from 200,000 to almost more than 1 million because we're looking at the top 2% of incomes at each state. So DC tends to be a bit of an outlier. So we are ordering these states, and so the x-axis is just if you take white earnings in a given state and you take the top 2%, where do you cross the top 2% line? So for instance, what this tells you is that in Connecticut, this number is a little shy of 800,000, whereas in West Virginia, this number is very closer to 300,000. Capturing, as we understand, sort of the inequality of incomes across America. But what this graph is trying to ask is, well, what happens when the top of the white earnings distribution is higher? How does that correlate with the gap between the top of other groups and white earnings? So specifically, this number, let me pick, I'll pick Minnesota here. Let me not lose Minnesota. Minnesota is here. So this is American Indian and Alaska Natives. So the top 2% of white men earnings is a little bit above 400,000, pretty much in line with 400,000 in the US. This number, 75%, means that when we look at the top 2% of American Indian and Alaska Native incomes earnings in Minnesota, it's about 3/4 of those, right? Notice that when we do that, this y-axis varies quite a bit across groups. So for instance, when we look at the Asian earnings related to white, this number is typically above 1, meaning that in many states in America, top Asian earnings are above top white earnings. But for the other groups, it tends to be below and substantially below for some. What I want you to take away from these graphs is that we can tend to see that places as the top white earnings go up, we see that the fraction, the relative top earnings for Black is falling, for American Indian tend to be falling, and the same thing for Hispanic. So the idea here is that here it's important to be able to look at top versus bottom. It's important to be able to look for different groups, and we can and think about it. So higher income states tend to have larger racial gaps. Now, one value of IDA could be like, well, maybe that's not surprising, but let me show you one way which IDA is really useful. Being able to see top incomes for different states is really hard because, and when you have survey data, a few observations, you can't do that. Here, you see that if you were using the median, where these numbers are much smaller, so it's an order of magnitude smaller, right? We don't basically see the same type of striking relationship, except maybe for Hispanic and Asian. So that was sort of a view into sort of the geography of not only income inequality among white earnings, but how it relates to the gap between not just Black and white, but other groups as well. So in the next set of slides, I'm going to tell you, kind of going back to the value of IDA and say, okay, what was it really, what do we learn from IDA as well that's we couldn't learn from these 100,000 observations in survey data, let's say from the CPS. So I'm going to go back and think about a couple of inequality trends leading into the pandemic that we knew and see how they differ when we use IDA data. I'm going to skip this slide. It just tells that the income concepts are not the same. This graph is looking at earnings growth where we normalize, so we're looking at earnings growth over from 2005 to 2019 for different parts of the income distribution. So let me select this purple triangle line here and track it. So this is P98. This will be the top 2% of earnings in the US and looking at how they change over time. So this number, a little above 2.2, tells that we have roughly 20% growth for the top 2% of earnings. Whereas when we look, well, if you're looking, so this is the line for the top 2%. We see that in IDA, that the bottom, so this will be the bottom 10%, the bottom 25%, that following the Great Recession, they bounce back, and they bounce back pretty strongly. So we see quite a bit of a fanning out, and we see at the same time, we see the fanning out being the very top grow more than the not so top, but at the same time, the bottom is sort of catching up. What's the picture like when we look at the CPS? Well, not only is it noisier, but we see that the fanning out we see at the top is not as pronounced. So we see a little more than a 10% gap here at the top. We don't see as much here. And also the timing of the bounce back at the bottom is not as clear. And finally, we tend to think that the bottom is bouncing back way more than we will infer in IDA. Again, the CPS is a survey. This one is the tax record. They can be different, and I'll tell you a couple of things about it shortly. So this will be what you will get when you look at the household income side, where the Form 1040s. We kind of have a similar story where here, because at the household level, we don't necessarily see sort of this will be the CPS. Again, we see a fanning out. So this is the inequality widening, meaning the top is gaining more than the bottom. However, putting the noise aside, and I can circle back to that later. But what you clearly see here is that we see just way more fanning out in household level income. So remember here, household here means in this tax record, we combine all the records and we just, and we order them. So we have way more fanning out in terms of income growth in IDA. Now, we also see that the bottom is it wiggles a little more. Why is that? And we discussed that in our research. We look carefully at it. When we see tax reform that induce people to file more, and those filers tend to be filing low incomes, that will tend to drag this bottom line number. So this will be and so also the requirement to file to be able to get some stimulus and others can kick in. So in the interest of time, I'm gonna just look maybe at, I'll show this. So the survey and the tax record are different, but we can ask why are they different? So this panel is showing at the bottom of earnings and the top of earnings, bottom quartile, top 10%. And this is just the difference between what we see in the CPS and this is what we see for the IRS. To do this, we're actually leveraging the fact that we can see people responding in the survey and connect them to their tax record and still be able to say meaningful things without revealing anything about them. And what we see here is that on average, at the bottom, we see slightly higher earnings in the survey, whereas at the top, these blue lines are the average, we tend to see lower earnings in the CPS. Now, we see that, for instance, people who file a Form 1099 tend to have even lower earnings reported in the CPS compared to their tax record, right? We also see that the survey, because it does imputations, tend to miss more when we have imputations. Not only that, that also maps into very different gaps across groups. The tax record and the survey record vary systematically from Black to Hispanic to white. And obviously the overall differences at the top is driven by the white gap because we have more white at the top. But even conditional being at the top, we see that the survey is underestimating white earnings by much more, almost a gap of $20,000 as opposed to $40,000 on average, and on average. So what I just showed you was the survey measures are useful. They're qualitatively similar, but they are noisier. The timing is different, and they can sort of change a little bit our understanding of how we understand how inequality is changing, but also how the lessons we can draw from the overall group to individual race and ethnicity groups. So let me take that lens of race and ethnicity and focus a little bit on Black-white earning gaps in America over this time period. And to do that, I'm going to start from a very influential paper that has looked using a larger survey called the American Community Surveys that has, roughly speaking, a couple million observations, has looking at white men against Black men earnings. So these, the dashed lines correspond to what you will get when you take the red dashed line will be you're looking at median earnings for white men. versus median earnings for Black men, in particular taking Black men's earnings minus white men's earnings. So this number 40 means that the median earning for Black men was a little less than about 40% less than the earnings for white men. This data, this could only be done for a couple of years, and so these are their numbers, the dashed lines. And what you will see here is that already following after the Great Recession, we can already see that these numbers are trending down. And it's not just at the median, but it's also at the very top. So top, this will be the 40 log point difference in the top 10% of Black earnings versus the top 10% of white earnings. What we're able to do with IDA is that we can construct that using more data and more years and track this more carefully. And what do we see? Not only do we see slightly larger gaps, so at the median, this will be about an extra 10% difference, but more importantly, we see that this gap is expanding. So for instance, the top 10% of earnings for Black men in IDA is now 50% less than the corresponding number among whites. So this is the sense in which we have these widening Black-white earnings for men. Even though we saw earlier that women's overall earnings were catching up compared to men, what we see here is that Black-white earnings are actually widening for Black women too. So what we see here, again, this line will be looking at the top 2% of Black women earnings compared to the top 2% of white women earnings. And this number goes from about a 20% being 25% less to probably almost like 35 to 40% less. So top Black women's earnings are falling behind top white women's earnings, even as overall women's earnings driven by white women earnings and Asian women earnings are catching up to white men's earnings, especially at the top. In fact, we see that this widening of the gap is really unique to Black earners. We don't see it for, here this is just for men, we don't see it for American Indian and Alaska Native, we don't see it for Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders, we don't see it for Hispanic, and we don't see it for Asian men, and if anything, we see a little bit of breaking out where Asian earnings are outstripping and outpacing corresponding white men earnings. So that was sort of the IDA bit on thinking about leveraging the race, the ethnicity, the gender, the years to paint again just this rich understanding of what income inequality means, that just showing us it has these very different dimensions and potentially asking us more questions on how we think inequality works. Now, I'm going to move a little more towards the second D in IDA. It's not just income distribution, there's also income dynamics. And so here I'm going to think about, we're going to use IDA, and this is borrowing from a very nice article that Lisa Mackay has written with Natalie Gabay, where we're looking at racial differences in terms of the likelihood of going from bottom to top. So what do I mean by that? So if I look at this big dot, this says that about 2/3 of men that are in the bottom quartile, the bottom 25% of earnings in a given year, in 2014 in particular, about 2/3 of them moved up out of the bottom quartile in the US. Those are the big circles of the US. This number is lower for women, meaning fewer women are able to climb out. What are these smaller dots? This is how those are if you do it state by state by state. Now, what we find here is that we have systematic differences across racial groups in this likelihood of moving up, starting from the same bottom bin within the same state. So this is looking at Minnesota, we're looking at all the earners that are in the bottom quartile and asking, how likely are you to move up? And we see that these dots are systematically sort of shifted upward as we go from Black and American Indian and Alaska Native to white and so on. It's also important to note that the rankings are not always trivial, right? Here we see a higher likelihood of moving up for Hispanic compared to white. So now we'll turn to, there's one dimension that highlights work that has been done by Johns Hopkins on US versus foreign-born workers. Again, this is a dimension that is really hard to get well in that we don't have in tax record, but that's really important just to understanding how the American economy works for all the workers, both for US and foreign born. And here, this is the striking finding. We just observe since after the Great Recession, we've just been observing a staggering growth for top foreign-born earnings. So what I'm showing you here is the top 10% for earnings for foreign-born versus US-born workers, top 1%, top 0.1%. Obviously, the y-axis are climbing up as we do that. But what I want you to show you to focus on is the gap between the blue line and the yellow gold line. Especially, and as we go more and more towards the top, you can, let's say, look at the top 1%. These numbers are roughly the same. Let's think they're about $220,000 in 2005. By 2019, that number for US-born workers is about $270,000, but it's $100,000 more for foreign-born workers. What's interesting is that in the analysis, we show and find that this is not driven by having an influx of new foreign-born workers. And in fact, over this time period, we have fewer foreign-born workers as a fraction of the workforce. This is important just to help us again understand how the US economy works, what are the drivers of the differences, and so on. Now, let me circle back to this exhibit A that I mentioned there, sort of the asterisk problem in the data. What we are able to do with IDA is to circumvent the issue of small population on individual tribal areas by combining them the same way a state as large as California, Texas is made up of very different counties, if you want. We just create this synthetic geography. We're understanding there are differences across them. And we have a piece that we co-wrote with our colleagues in CD, in particular CICD, where we carefully think through what identity means, what space means, what sovereignty means, but we still are able to just create this synthetic boundary, geographic boundary, where we can think about native earnings on what you can think of as in native areas. So how do we do that? We're able to compare people who are who identify American Indian, Alaska Native, or Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander versus not. And we look at them in the collective combined geography of all the native areas as delineated by the US Census Bureau. I'm going to show you one graph that kind of highlights one way to understand the world that we couldn't do if we weren't able to separate native area versus non-native area. So this graph, for instance, is looking at the median earnings for two groups relative to the median of the US. The line with the square markers is tracking American Indian and Alaska Native men in the US. So this is telling us that going into the Great Recession, the median earnings for American Indian and Alaska Native earners in the US was about 2/3 of the median for the median earnings for men in the US overall. It dips in the Great Recession, recovers, and kind of keeps going up. And it stood about 70% by 2019. When we're able to go back and understand that there are people who live on tribal areas and not, we observe that going into the Great Recession, the red line is tracking native men's earnings in native areas. And these were roughly the same 2/3, tracking pretty well. But our understanding of how the Great Recession unfolded around this time is very different. Thanks to this aggregation, we're able to see that native earnings on native land collapsed more during the Great Recession and basically haven't really recovered in relative terms, right? So this is kind of a striking example of when you're able to somehow even solve a little bit the asterisk problem, you're able to already learn quite a bit. So on that note, I think I'm almost there. I think IDA really helps broaden our perspective on when you think about incomes in America. Race, gender, and ethnicity, among others, continue to be very key markers of income differences in the US. IDA brings together just a comprehensive set of resources to help advance our understanding, our knowledge of this rich quilt of income experiences. And thanks to just this high quality administrative data that we're able to aggregate at the subnational level for different groups. I really thank you for coming. I invite you all to just go explore, visualize, and use the data at minneapolisfed.org/IDA. Stay tuned for more updates in terms of research, insight, data viz updates, use cases, and hopefully soon, we hope, new data for the pandemic years. It takes a village. A lot of people on the research department were at GSI, our wonderful partners in public affairs, our Census Bureau partners, and many other people, amazing people connected at the back. Thank you again.
Thank you, Illenin. If folks have questions for Illenin, please type them in the chat on Zoom. And actually, the first question I was going to ask you just alluded to there at the end. We had a questioner asking about pandemic data and when might we see pandemic data in the tool? And also, Illenin, what do you think the impact will be of that pandemic data? How will that change what we can see?
Yeah, no, thank you. I think we're working on it, obviously. We made the deliberate choice to wait to have sort of the entire pandemic year cycle data so that when we have the data, we're able to analyze things as kind of they work through and settle in a little bit. There's been a lot of macroeconomic changes happening over the last 4 years, as we know. And so we are kind of getting there. We're hoping to be able to at least work through 2022 and work on new research collaboratively with the U.S. Census Bureau so that we disclose new insights and we're actively working with our partners on that. But we're aiming for sort of a combined sort of 2020, 2021, and at least 2022. One of the things that we are really paying attention to is just being able to be careful about not just people were just in 2019, but where they kind of were a little more permanently. So having a sense of where was your location really, so that we distinguish sort of the blips going into the pandemic from sort of where your usual place in the income distribution is. There are obviously a lot of other questions we can think about, but that's one way we want to think carefully about it. And so, yeah, so those are some of the, and we will see, but we know that there's been a lot of changes both at the top and at the bottom. And so we can't wait just to see the gender dimension is going to be probably very salient as well. And so we'll be doing the analysis, we'll be doing the research, and in the same vein as this, we'll be sharing new research with new data, collaboratively with our U.S. Census Bureau partners.
Well, and related to that, Illenin, now we've got some folks in the chat very excited about this data and wanting more, wanting what was missing. You had mentioned earlier that this data doesn't include taxes and transfers. And we have a questioner saying, but if we're concerned about inequality writ large, it'd be really helpful to see that. So is there any hope of getting those things?
Yeah, I think there's always scope for more research and more targeted research. And there is, as we know, a lot of research on thinking about how understanding of poverty, for instance, changes when we include transfers or not. How understanding of inequality in income and wealth changes when we carefully take into account the progressivity of the tax code on the different types of exemptions that exist. But one way to think about it is that the way we're working with data, both is what we have, but maybe sometimes it's important to understand where and how the income shows up first before it's kind of shuffled around. Now, obviously, how much people work also depend on the tax code in place. And that's where we hope that this data can be also helpful, because we can still combine, and it won't just be statistic. You can kind of try to model the interaction of tax code and others. But I think it's obviously tax data has to be dealt with carefully. Right now, we don't have that data. But for the people who are really interested, the IRS has a set of publications called the Statistic of Income, the IRS AOSOI tables, where they actually give us a relatively detailed look at, let's say, a sense of sort of how not just by law what the tax should be, but what people are kind of paying. We want a granularity, and the data we have allows us to do it this way. But we can still learn quite a bit when we are not interested in, let's say, gender differences or race ethnicity differences. So that's kind of the upshot is we'd love to have it. We don't have it. You can still learn a lot from the IRS SOI. But at the same time, we think it's actually also a clean way to measure what happens before taxes and deductions and so many things with the observed kick in.
Well, and again, related to that about data that folks would like to see, we have a questioner who's asking about rural versus urban
Yeah.
differences. And is there a way to get this at the county level so that we could see that?
Yeah. So no, those are big on our wish. That's big on our wish list as well. I think the let me so speaking of counties, I mean, we have 50 states, we have 3,000 plus counties. Some of them are super small. If you think about the way we're slicing the data, I think of Asian women and the very top 1 or 2%, right? So you could probably maybe you saw it when I showed that graph when I was comparing top white men's income and top non-white men income. When we went to Asian or American, Indian, Alaska Native, we have fewer dots. Because as you start shrinking the population and slicing it further and further up, you run it again into the curse of the small population. And so that's really going against the county level analysis. I do international trade and trade reforming effects in the U.S. and we use a lot of these commuting zones where we combine the counties. That's potentially one way to think about it. It's not quite yet on the deck, but we're thinking about it. So that's the answer to the question to the when it comes to the county. It's desirable, but one has to be careful. You maybe for some questions we can still do it, but it cannot just be this bigger systematic release. When it comes to rural versus urban, we've been thinking about it. Let me put it that way. We did res, non-res. Maybe we're gonna do urban, non-urban. It's a little trickier, but I mean, it's not trickier. We have some constraints, but we've been thinking about it. Yeah, thank you.
We have a questioner who is asking you showed some slides about individuals moving up the income chain, shifting, gaining ground. This individual is asking, do we have any data showing individuals who have dropped maybe from the top 1% to a lower level?
Absolutely. So I didn't go too much into it, but the way the IDA has a relatively rich set of income mobility measures. What we do is that we'll take a state like Minnesota and we can take earnings. And what we do is we say, let's split earnings into from bottom to top. So here we have to bin in a bit. We can do 4 bins, bottom quartile, lower bottom, lower middle, upper middle, and top. And then we ask, if you start in that group, how likely are you to move up and down? But we do that by group. So we can look at that number. And that's kind of where these numbers are coming from. Now we're looking at the bottom quartile here. But obviously, if you're at the top, you can only stay at the top or fall down. So we're going to see that number. And the upshot is it kind of mirrors some of the things we expect. I don't want to quickly zoom through the slides, but maybe I could. Give me a second. I think it's interesting. So I'm going to allow myself to exit the presentation and quickly show this one graph that I think the person asking the question might like. All right, can you, oh, sorry. Let me try again, Shift F5. No, I'm almost there. I'm gonna try one more time, and if I fail, Carmi, I won't try again. But I'm almost there. One more try. Awesome. All right, so this is Minnesota, looking at Asian women and Black, I'm sorry, Asian in Minnesota and Black in Minnesota. Why did I cross out women? Because for our ability to be able to look at all those things, sometimes we don't do all the combinations, but we still learn a few things. So here's the upshot. Asian in Minnesota, so this is, I think, looking at 2014 to 2019, the same 5-year horizon in that chart I showed you. Conditional on starting in the top 25%, 80% of the Asian earners in the top earnings stay in the top earnings. 82% to be precise. That number is 70%, 71% for Black earners. So these are people that are in the same very top of Minnesota as earnings distribution. But one group is more likely to stay at the top, the other is more likely to fall down. And when they fall, it straddles a little more, but you gradually fall, kind of. So that's the answer, an illustration of the answer to the question there about moving up and down.
Well, and that leads me to ask Illenin, you mentioned that a number of the findings that you've found since we've gotten this information have sort of confirmed things that we already knew. I'm wondering what for you has been the most surprising find that you didn't necessarily already know.
I, I think so. The way I think about what we've learned is that it's as if we're filling in gaps and blanks, meaning we know some things are for the whole of the US, and we were guessing this is how we'll work for part of it. So when it falls in line, like fine. When equalitative goes, you're like fine. But I think the the first thing for me is that when, for instance, we see that the falling behind, as we see here, is just as big at the bottom as the top, meaning the difference between Asian and Black for moving out of the bottom, which is about 11 percentage points here, is almost the same as the difference in staying at the top. What it tells me is that when we have that understanding, it implies that the theories and the stories and the how we think this is working is no longer as simple, right? The stories we load on sort of economics and market versus other institutions, that's where these groups differ. And to me, the data, even in a way, it is useful. It's going to be useful in disciplining where institutions matter and where existing stories that are not per se institutions, but let's say markets simply are playing out. So for instance, one good example, and I think I'm gonna show that here. I think, give me a second, because I think it's a nice finding. Yes, this is a good example. This is Minnesota earnings in 2017 for Black women, Hispanic women, Asian women, and American Indian, Alaska Native women. If you look at the top 10%, it's roughly, they are holding roughly 30%, a third of all the earnings these women are bringing in. Within each group, the top earners are basically, top 10 are holding about the 30, a third. And yet these women are earning very different amount. So it means that inequality within a group is very similar, and yet these women are faring very differently. What's the difference between the top Black woman here and the top Asian woman? So that on average, they're systematically different, even though they're kind of winning the race in the same way, quote unquote, in their same group. And to me, this is what points to we need to really understand what is related to these markers that just working systematically differently across these columns, even though within inequality still works the same way. And I didn't know what to find, for instance, for this number. It could have been different. It could have been that no, part of it is that you just don't have enough super earners, and that's why on average it's different. We don't know that until we slice it and look at it and measure it. So it's a little bit of a long answer, but I think to me it's pointing to institutions, but also pointing to what relates to group and what relates to how within group. That's one finding. Thank you.
Thanks, Illenin. We have time for one last question. I'm going to end with one I'm sure you'll appreciate, which is for the researchers out there who are excited to dig into this data and maybe need someone from the Fed to show them what it can do. How can they reach out to you or others?
We are the data. We're just very excited for. That's why we release the data. It's publicly used. Our contact is on the website. Reach out to us. We want people to use this and to do more research and share more with us. So reach out through our official contact page on the Minneapolis Fed Institute webpage. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Illenin. And we will be sending out copies of Illenin's slides, as well as a link to this video to everyone who was registered in attendance today. Thank you so much for joining us. We'd appreciate getting your feedback as you close out of this Zoom. And we hope to see you again at a future virtual event. Thank you.
Thank you, Carly. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.